I have a question for you. What was the most surprising chapter to come to DVD? And if so, what made that chapter so surprising to you? Now, I'll kind of speak for everybody in the sense, I would assume that it would be Chucky, only because I'm pretty sure a lot of people doubted how he would work in the game. I always felt Chucky could work when twins got introduced because of Victor, of course. Sure, there was a few head scratchers as to how he can fit in the game, but I always felt that he can fit. They kind of surprised the hell out of me with Charles E. Ray's soul though. I didn't expect that. I honestly expected him to use his voodoo and have Cyrus float in the air, kind of like Sadako.
Adi Dewey Dembella, give me the power, I beg of you.
I was also a bit surprised at the camera angle too, because of the fact that we just never had a third person camera angle for a killer before. But thinking about it, it makes sense for Chucky, because for a killer his size, if it wasn't first person, he would just be chasing grass the whole time. But beforehand, what made Chucky so surprising is the fact that he was questionable, right? He was a questionable killer in the sense that a lot of people weren't really sure if he would work, or set on the fact that he couldn't work at all. And that's kind of what I want to explain for this video. Just dealing with chapters that I feel are also questionable, like Chucky. Most of these chapters I already talked about on the channel before, but I just want to talk about if they really can work though. Because really when it comes to my concept videos, I'm not entirely set on these killers working in the game. I'm honestly not sure if these killers can work in the game, you know? I could say a killer doesn't fit right now, and then 2 years from now we see that killer in DVD. So it's always a 50-50 of whether a killer can actually fit or not. I think sometimes it's really entirely based on the devs, or just logic in general, but then we have to think about the entity, because the entity could bend logic to its favor for that killer. So we always got to keep that in mind. But yeah, here's just some chapters that I find questionable to fit in DVD. Now there's a specific reason why I find the Smile Demon pretty questionable to fit in DVD, and that's because of its faithful factor from the movies. If you watch the Smile movies, you would know that the Smile Demon likes to feed on your personal trauma, perceiving your perception of reality, basically fucking with you. And then it does this until it kills you, which it makes you commit suicide, and then it makes you pass it along to somebody else if that person happened to watch you commit suicide. Now, how can we add that exact concept into DVD? I find that questionable, because the survivors only have one life, so how can you really make a power out of a survivor having to, you know, off themselves? But this is actually the chapter I find least questionable, because what I find most questionable about this chapter is not the off themselves part, it's not the off themselves aspect of the killer possibly being implemented into DVD. It's just everything else in general. How would the killer's animations look like? How would the killer's weapon look like? Would it use his hands to like scratch survivors? I just think of things like that, because honestly what I think the Smile Demon can do if it was in DVD is that it will just use hallucinations. That will be its power.
Holly.
It would perceive survivors into thinking that things are happening and it's actually not happening, or things are there and it's actually not there. But basically amplify that up to like 10. This will be the hallucination killer for DVD. It won't be no doctor, it won't be no known. This will be the hallucination killer. This killer will literally make you lose your mind, in a sense. That's the way I can see it working in DVD. This demon is already creepy as hell, so I can only imagine it chasing survivors. Savage D, if you don't mind, a smile menu and chase theme would be dope. But anyways, back to the hallucinations and what I was talking about. Maybe the Smile Demon can have survivors hallucinate to the point where fellow survivors look like the Smile Demon from the affected survivor's POV. Or it can even have gens appear in different locations from the affected survivor's POV. So when the survivor approaches the generator, it will disappear because it's not really at that location, wasting the survivor's time in the process. Something I think would be really unique is if the survivor is going so batshit crazy that they start hallucinating fellow survivors in the lobby, but they're not really there, it's just AI. So say if an AI survivor heals you while you're injured, after completing the healing action it will leave you broken along with your aura being revealed for a certain duration. Maybe the Smile Demon can also use these AI survivors that follow the affected survivor as a teleport, so the affected survivor who's hallucinating must stay aware of a fellow survivor following them. It can very well be a hallucination. The Smile Demon would see the hallucination aura intermittently as it's following the affected survivor. So maybe every 6 seconds, it sees the hallucination's aura for 3 seconds, repeating that process for about 35 seconds before ending. If the smile demon looks at the aura of the hallucination, it can teleport to it during its aura reveal window. I think it would be cool if this was the teleport animation. That way DVD is referencing both of the films. If they use this approach of hallucinations, I feel it makes the most sense because the smile demon targets you individually. So maybe it can have a similar mechanic to Ghostface, since Ghostface has to target survivors individually in order to build stock progress. Which is somewhat not true because if survivors are in the same location, Ghostface could build stock progress simultaneously for both survivors. But I guess the smile demon can just choose which survivors to go after. The smile demon can have something similar to the Ghostface stock in progress, but instead what it has to do to get the progress up instead of being stealthy like Ghostface will be different. Maybe the longer it's in chase with survivors, a progress bar passively increases faster rather than when it's not in chase with survivors. Basically, the more you focus on one survivor, though multiple survivors can be affected by hallucinations at once, there's more likely the chance they will begin to hallucinate. This would be good for snowballing since the smile demon can bounce between different survivors and build up hallucinations. Similar to how it's ideal for Oni to snowball since he will get his power faster, and it will of course have a different effect of making survivors hallucinate in ways we never seen before in DVD. That's why I'm saying it would be cool if this killer would be the hallucination killer for DVD. I'm kind of curious of the Mori possibility for the smile demon too. Like maybe the Mori could be that the smile demon enters your body through the mouth only to rip you in half from the inside out. Something crazy like that we never seen before in DVD. But man, I don't know when the devs will go that far for DVD. Who knows? I find Smile questionable because there are things about it that I feel are questionable. Like we don't see how the demon moves or anything like that, but I guess you could always make that up, right? They could always get creative with that. I mean, if I believe, I don't think we never seen Pinhead chase anybody or use chains to actually chase anybody in the Hellraiser movies, or have Sadako throw out a whole symbol to injure somebody in the movie, and we haven't seen Pyramid Head use Punishment of the Damned in any Silent Hill game or movie. So they can always get creative with the Smile Demon if they really wanted to, and have it look dreadful in different ways. Especially since there could be huge cosmetic potential for the Smile Demon. If not, I think the very least we could get Smile related is a Dredge cosmetic as the Smile Demon. I think that would be pretty terrifying. But do you guys think Smile could work? Do you find Smile questionable? Now, I know what you're thinking, why the hell would they put a shark in DVD? I know. And that's why Jaws is probably one of the most questionable things to even be brought about in DVD. I honestly don't even know if Jaws is possible, I'll be honest. The idea of it does sound goofy, but I do think it could work, honestly. It's just that it will be really unfaithful, that's all. I have talked about Jaws before. You could check out the video on how I feel Jaws could work. But briefly speaking, what I had mentioned in that video, I basically think the entity could take the shark out of the water, but then use the water as a whirlpool for the shark can navigate as it's roaming in the game. So you basically see a whirlpool with a floating shark. I kid you not though, that's not as ridiculous as it gets. It could pick up with its teeth, and while it's carrying the survivor, it could attack with its fin, and its basic attack could be its teeth or its fin. It could maybe switch it up from time to time, who knows. But that's basically the most simplistic but unfaithful way I could see Jaws working. If they really wanted to go that route, it would look really strange and goofy, but that's the best way I could see it. There was other ways people mentioned this, like the trial being filled with water, almost like Dredge's Nightfall, but instead of darkness, it's literally just filled with water the whole time, and the survivors is spawned in the trial with scuba gear. And I'm guessing the entity just removes water physics to make that possible. I like to be as open-minded as possible when it comes to, you know, things just working in the game, but I do think that's a bit too much, just in my opinion. I honestly don't think it would be that bad just to see a whirlpool in the shark, but this chapter is undoubtedly questionable. Like, I'm not even sure if you even see Jaws in DVD. This is probably one of the most unlikely chapters to ever exist in the game, realistically. I don't think we will ever see Bruce. If they somehow one day bring Jaws to DVD, that will literally drop my jaws to the floor. I would love to see how they would do it if it's not either of these two ways, because that would generally blow my mind if they get this to work in the game. I find this to be the most questionable chapter in DVD, if not just the chapter that's not going to happen, but I would love to be proven wrong about that. Now, A Quiet Place I also talked about on the channel because I did a concept for A Quiet Place. Basically, long concept short, I would basically want the Death Angel to work like a forever spirit in a way, bringing on the challenge of you not being able to actually see the survivors in the game. There will be indicators, there will be footsteps, there will be things that will help you track their survivors down and get their initial location of where they're at, but you just can't see them. Literally can't see them. And that idea alone, I just find that to be so controversial, but I love that because of how different it is, and it'll show that the devs are being experimental. The survivors must be quiet the whole game, meaning even if they run, they could be hurt by the Death Angel, but the Death Angel just has to track them down. The tracking down process of the power would be pretty easy, considering the fact that you can't see the survivors. I find this chapter so questionable because I feel like they have no choice but to add the blind element. Because I did hear some people say that they don't have to add the blind element for the Death Angels. Because, for example, look at killers like Pyramid Head or Demogorgon that they seem like they can't see, they seem like they're blind, that looks like they have no sight, so they could just do the same thing for the Death Angel. But I disagree because that's what basically makes the killer unique in the first place. That's what makes the Death Angels unique. They're blind, they can't see you, they rely on extreme hearing to kill you, so they use that to their advantage, and I expect the devs to put that in the game. There was a lot of other handful of ways that people mentioned how the Death Angel could fit in the game, which I found very interesting because it was really interesting ideas too. Like, for example, someone said that it could be like Wraith but for survivors in a unique way. So when you're the Death Angel, you see the survivors but they look like they're invisible. Like you could see them but you can't see them at the same time, if that makes sense. It's like they're Wraith, you know? So you could probably see like the outline of the survivors moving, but you can't really see the survivors because of how transparent they look in the first place. So it'll be challenging sight wise, but of course the power will rely on hearing. Maybe exactly like Wraith, the farther the survivors are, they're completely invisible, you cannot see them. But the closer you get to them because of your power and you being able to hear where they're possibly located, then they start to appear and you start to see the transparent aura of them, and then you get to chase them like that. I think that could be a really interesting idea for the Death Angel too. That way you don't have to make the challenge of not being able to see survivors too grueling. It's just an overall neat idea that I recently saw, so credit to this person who mentioned this idea. What I'm starting to notice is that the devs are getting more and more experimental, so I won't be surprised if maybe we don't see the Quiet Place coming to DBD. We could see a killer like the Death Angel, basically using hearing as a power, but they're blind. I just think it will be a unique breath of fresh air because how much of a game changer it will be to face that killer. Like you literally have to be quiet. You can't make a sound though, that's gonna cost you. I think that would be the scariest shit to come into the game. Of course there'll be things to help you from here and there, like if you've seen them on concept. I feel like it's only fair. I don't know though. The Quiet Place is still pretty questionable as a chapter in general, just because of the idea of sight actually being removed alone. But I think there's definitely ways they could work around that. I just think the chapter is questionable. I don't think it won't happen at all. However, like I said, if they end up not considering the chapter, maybe they would just add in an original killer with that concept, basically Spirit 2.0, which will be Forever Spirit. If they don't consider A Quiet Place another license with that same exact concept, which I think could work, is maybe The Last of Us, and they could add in a clicker. But then again, if the devs were really considering The Last of Us chapter, I think the bloater or the Rat King would be one of the killers. It could be like Nemesis, where you play as the bloater and then maybe the clickers roam around the map, 2 clickers. That would be terrifying. Not sure what the Rat King would do though. Now to jump to the elephant in the room, what they really consider the possibility of adding the first ever killer that can imitate survivors, considering Swift killing that idea entirely. Now I always felt like if they really did wanted to go for this idea, that they would have went for this a long time ago. It's just one of those classic ideas that I know people will want in the game, but we just never got. Even if it's just for fun, you know, just disguising as a survivor just for fun. It doesn't have to be too powerful all the time. I know Swift kills that. They'll basically just use comms to counter the killer the whole time. The survivor would just be like, hey Jeff, is that you? Crouch. And if Jeff doesn't crouch, the killer's outed already, you know? It's like, how can you really make, you know, disguising yourself as a survivor effective? And if so, it will only be effective for really like 3 seconds if you're playing against a Swift on comms. If you happen to always play against solos, then the killer would be a benefit and the killer will actually work. But it's just Swift that's always a consideration. Comms especially. Just the logic of communicating in general defeats the whole idea of this type of killer. That's why when I mentioned the thing on my channel, the concept of the thing, I mentioned it as a game mode since I feel that that would be the most fitting, but I know a licensed game mode would never happen because, well, it's a licensed game mode, you know? It's like, when did we ever get that? Sure, it's the first time for everything. What I was explaining was that maybe for the first time they could have something where it's like a DLC where you can buy the game mode, and for those who purchase the game mode, they could play the game mode. However, there's a ton of problems with this, because say if a handful of people didn't buy the game mode, wouldn't that hurt queue times? It's like, sure, you could run into the same people over and over again, but that would just kind of make the game mode less interesting, you know? Even though if you did look at the game mode concept for the thing that I made, you wouldn't even know if you're playing with the same people, because it will always be anonymous. You can't see the player's gamer tags, and you also can't invite your friends. So add in that aspect where you can't trust nobody from the start, and that trust has to be built throughout the game. I'll leave the concept down in the description below if you're interested. Now, I don't think the thing is not possible at all. I think if they wanted to go the route where imitating a survivor is not too effective, and that's not really the main power, and that's more so the side power, like a side ability, just something you can do as the thing, and the thing itself has a different power, that could maybe work, because at least imitating is not its main focus. But it's like, doesn't that take away from what makes the thing in the first place? It would 100% be 50-50. Like, I'm pretty sure if the devs were really considering the thing, the first thing that comes to fans' minds would be to, you know, fool the opposing survivors into thinking they're a fellow survivor. It's like, I'm pretty sure people will want that to be the main thing you do as the thing. That's why I said if that was the main power, it would be 50-50, basically like the trapper, in the sense where you're not sure if the survivors will always step in the trap. In the thing's case, you're not sure if you will always fool the opposing survivors as a fellow survivor. It may work sometimes, it may not work sometimes. It will be 50-50. That's why I do think the route where imitating a survivor is just something you can do as a side or passive ability, rather than it being an ability that's main. Cause at least you could get some things out of it rather than nothing out of it at all. It would just be some games where that's actually effective and you happen to fool people, and it would be other games where they will completely call you out, right? So I guess in that light, the thing can actually work if they really wanted it to. I'm just not too sure how people would feel about constantly being outed as a thing, considering that's like what the thing does, you know? Like, the thing is basically the master of disguise. Like, that shit can imitate any life form. So it's like, sure, the faithful aspect from the movies would be toned down a lot because it won't be 100% faithful, but I think they could always add in a fitting power, like I mentioned. Just because we didn't see the killer use his power from his adaptation doesn't mean we can't see something that completely fits the killer in general. My idea of it was just, you know, technically bringing Among Us to Dead by Daylight just with the thing's theme, because I think even that would be a dope way to introduce the thing into DVD. But DLC game mode, that's not gonna happen. Come on, let's be real. At this point, we should know why Cujo is just probably one, if not the most questionable killer next to Joel's. That would be an option for DVD. It's a dog. But like I said, I like to be open-minded about things, because technically speaking, Cujo can work like a forever wolf form Dracula. It's just the animations that I feel would be a problem. You can have Cujo just running around and trial biting survivors, but it's just, how would it get them on a hook? How would it pick up survivors? How would it break the pallet? Just things like that, you know? It's like, sure, I like to think the entity could help it. It could help Cujo by carrying the survivor, but it's like, how would that work? That would look odd and strange and just weird for Cujo. I don't know. I guess we could kind of get creative with it here. I don't know. Bats could hold survivors up in the air. Cujo got bit by bats, right? So I don't know. The entity made the bats carry survivors and help Cujo, since they turn Cujo into what Cujo is. I don't fucking like, that's the only problem. Only because history repeats itself. We got twins, people doubted Chucky, and they seem to be on board with Chucky not coming to DVD. Boom, we see Chucky in DVD. Surprise, surprise. Then we get the Houndmaster in DVD. Who supports him basically is the power for the Houndmaster? A dog. Take Dracula's third person wolf form and slap that onto Cujo. Wouldn't that technically be Cujo? It's just the animations that's really the problem, right? If Cujo was even possible to come into DVD in the first place. I'm not saying this like Cujo is coming to DVD. I know that it's not gonna happen, right? At least I'm pretty sure it's not gonna happen. Cause I don't know, man. The devs is getting more experimental with these chapters, so I don't know what to expect nowadays. I'll be honest. Like apparently there's rumors that Jurassic Park is coming after Five Nights at Freddy's. Like that blows my mind. I would love to see how a dinosaur could fit in DVD. It just seems like they're getting more and more diverse with these chapters. It's like, who knows what to expect at this point. So it's like the chapters we find questionable could wind up being the chapters that end up being our future. Well, the game's future, I should say. And then they only evolve from that point. And that's why I also just like to be so open-minded about just anything when it comes to DVD in general. Because you just never know, you know? Sure, you could look at the most realistic outlook of something and whether it's definitely not going to come into the game. But it's like, how do we know for sure? And that's kind of where I think these stand. I know there's probably a lot more things questionable chapters to be specific, that you guys may think about, and I'm just curious to hear what you guys may think about, because I honestly find these 5 to be like pretty questionable, some being more least questionable than others, and those others being the most questionable than the others that are not so questionable, and that very well may come into the game at some point, but we just gotta see. But anyways, do you guys find these chapters to be questionable? If so, let me know down below. I despise y'all. I hope y'all rot in another realm, and I won't see y'all until GTA 6 release. Goodbye.